You know why we have cases? Because we test so much. And in many ways, it's good. And in many ways, it's foolish. COVID, 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 COVID. By the way, on November 4th, you won't hear about it anymore.
At the debate on Thursday night, Donald Trump said and is still saying, we're rounding the corner. It's going away. We're learning how to live with it. What I told him at the debate, we're not learning how to live with it. You're asking us to learn how to die with it.
Donald Trump and Joe Biden making their closing arguments with just days to go in this campaign. There's little doubt that Trump's mishandling of the COVID pandemic is overwhelmingly the dominant issue. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to a video conference edition of the New York Times Close Up. Mike Pence's top aides contracting coronavirus put even more focus on the pandemic, and that's on top of a major surge in cases and hospitalizations around the country, especially in the Midwest and Mountain West. Meanwhile, there's been record-setting early voting with tens of millions of Americans already casting their ballots. The number of early voters could reach 100 million by Election Day. So is there any question that coronavirus is the defining issue of the campaign? And what does that mean for the president? We'll talk about it all in a minute. First, a quick poll check. The Economist YouGov poll has Biden up by 9 points nationally. As for the battleground states, Reuters Ipsos has Biden up by 9 in Wisconsin, 7 in Michigan, 5 in Pennsylvania. Let's talk politics now with Mara Gay, a member of the New York Times editorial board, and we should point out a COVID survivor herself, and New York Times contributing writers Eleanor Randolph and Clyde Haberman. Mara, you did have COVID. You were still recovering from it. Would anyone who cared about COVID, either had it, knew someone who had it, and that includes most of us, would anyone concerned about it or the way it was handled vote for President Trump?
It's a great question. It's hard to see how or why they could, although it's certainly the case that I have friends who have been sick for a long time, like me, and recovering for a long time, who have relatives who, despite the experience of those they care about, are still sticking with Donald Trump. Those are the hardest core supporters. I think, in fact, that one of the reasons that you do see the tables turning really toward Joe Biden so decisively in swing states like Wisconsin and Michigan is the coronavirus and its impact that it's had for months now up close on people there. And so for me, I voted the other day. It was immensely personal for a lot of reasons when I voted for Joe Biden. But one of those reasons was that I do feel that Donald Trump personally is in part to blame for me being sick for many months. And for those I love, losing jobs, being ill. And it's really hard once you make that connection to see this politics as anything other than personal.
This is such a hypothetical question, of course, but if Joe Biden had been president, do you think you would have not gotten COVID?
I actually believe I would not have gotten COVID. And the reason is because, and of course, there is always an element of who knows, but this was not an act of God. This was a virus that the president knew far more about than he told the American people. So if I had known that the national security apparatus was telling the president of the United States as early as February, if not before, that this was a virus that was airborne and that was also affecting younger people, I would have acted differently. I think a lot of New Yorkers would have as well. I think that New York in particular really was ambushed. I do agree with Governor Cuomo about that. I don't think Cuomo's handling of it has been perfect by any means, but I do believe we were ambushed by this virus and left unprotected because Donald Trump knew how dangerous it was and chose not to tell anybody about it. So yes, I do blame him personally.
Eleanor, one of the things that I find striking is that this campaign has been going on for months. A lot of money has been spent. A lot of money has been raised by Joe Biden. A lot of television commercials. We've had the two conventions. We've had a Supreme Court nomination. We've had debates that have gone more polite and less polite. And we've had the vice presidential nominations. And yet the polls really haven't changed very much. We've had now massive mail and early voting, people expressing themselves weeks before the election itself. So what has mattered in this election, and has the campaign mattered at all? Has what the candidates said or done in the last couple of months made any difference? And if not, why not?
Thank you, Sam. I think we just have different sources of information, all of us, and the people who watch Fox News believe only Fox News, and the rest of us who try to have a more varied news feed have a different take on things. Sam, I've been thinking about this vote coming up and how, Donald Trump, the one thing he does is he projects his own flaws on the rest of us. And the fact that he keeps talking about stealing this election and how, it's fraudulent and things are going on that are unfair. What I see is a real effort to curb the vote, to question the vote. I mean, if you look at almost every aspect of the way people are voting, I mean, you can think about mail-in votes. What did they do? They screwed up the post office. I mean, it's as though somebody methodically went through and tried to figure out how to limit votes, especially among Democrats. And so if you put that together with the Supreme Court now, it just, I worry very much, no matter who wins this election, the other side will believe that it was stolen.
Clyde, what do you think? Will people accept the results of the election, even if we don't know election night, and if it takes days, maybe even weeks, like it did in the year 2000, for us to know the results?
I'd like to think so. This notion that the Trump people keep spreading that the vote that's existing on the night of November 3rd is all that matters is, of course, nonsense, and it's historically nonsensical. If I can go back just for a second, Sam, to Mara's COVID battle, Trump had his own brush with this thing, and most people who I've known who've had brushes with mortality tend to emerge somewhat different. This man is absolutely unchanged. He, as despicable as he was when he came into the whole thing, it is an extraordinary lack of empathy that I don't think we've ever seen from any president, certainly not in the lifetime of the oldest folks among us, which I'm among, obviously. But this is an extraordinary development. As for the counting of the votes, I'd like to think that the courts will uphold whatever it takes, however long it takes. Again, you mentioned 2000, that was a prime example, but there have been many others over the centuries. And this notion that by midnight on November 3rd, it's whoever's ahead, that's the winner, is like calling off a baseball game after the fourth inning. This is just nonsense, and we all know that. And I don't think there's a single honest member of the media, by which I often now exclude Fox News and the New York Post, there's no honest member of our line of work who's going to accept any statement of victory by Trump. Of course he's going to claim it's all rigged and fixed. He did it in 2016 until, lo and behold, he actually won in the Electoral College. But even then, he wouldn't accept the fact that he lost a popular vote. This is who he is. He's not going to change. And so we have to just ensure that he doesn't get away with it. if he loses. I mean, if he winds up winning the popular vote and the electoral vote, not my choice, but so be it. But I don't think that's going to happen.
Mara, Nate Cohn reported in the Times toward the end of the week that while Joe Biden is leading among non-white voters by a mammoth amount, the lead is not as big as it was for Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so there has been, the Republicans have made some inroads, albeit very small ones compared to their strength among white voters and white men in particular. But they've made some inroads among Black and Hispanic men. And, essentially the Republicans are trying to peel off votes anywhere they can because they are looking at the margins since Donald Trump has done nothing to expand his base overall. So I think one of the things that is really important for the country and for the Democrats is that Barack Obama in particular continues to speak out as he has on the campaign trail as an extremely effective surrogate, the most effective surrogate, he and his wife, he and Michelle Obama, the former First Lady, because Black men in particular are really disenfranchised in this country, always have been, high rates of unemployment, and frankly, unfortunately, often are far less likely to vote than Black women. And so these are not necessarily reliable voters, but the Trump campaign has been, I would say, very cynical in appealing to the same, making the same appeals that they make to white men, which is really centered in masculinity and about jobs. So I think the way to blunt that is by having Joe Biden and the Democrats, and particularly Barack Obama, speak directly to the concerns of young Black men in particular, but all Black men and Hispanic men, so that they feel seen, respected, heard, and they don't give Donald Trump any opportunity to take those votes away. That is, I think, essential. And I think that, the Biden campaign has really shied from making those direct appeals. But we've seen that the Trump campaign is shameless in these appeals. So it's extremely important for Democrats to talk to these voters.
Clyde, let me go back to something you said earlier. You would accept the results either way, as I think most people will. Joe Biden is leading in national polls now, and in some of the battleground states. The only a couple of days remaining until Election Day. Is there anything, and of course we've been awfully surprised before in this campaign, is there anything Donald Trump can do to take the lead?
I can't see what it could be. Some late October, early November surprise. So much, as you said earlier, tens of millions have already voted. This cake is already about at least half baked, if not more. This election doesn't boil down to Hunter Biden. It doesn't boil down to Azerbaijan against Armenia. It boils down to decency. And in the end, people are going to have to decide, do they want a man who I think a fair majority of this country feels is thoroughly indecent in every respect, or somebody who is definitely flawed by almost any measure, but carries a banner of decency, which this country would like to think it represents. So that's what I think it comes down to. And again, we'll just have to see. I guess the one unknown that I might have alluded to earlier was these armed groups that are threatening insurrection of some sort, and it would be insurrection if they mess around. This remains an unknown. I'd like to think that they're more bluster and parading around than actual dangers, but again, we'll have to see.
Eleanor, what do you think the fate of the Electoral College is depending on this election? If the Republicans lose Texas, for instance, will they be saying, hey, maybe we ought to take another look at the Electoral College? Or is the Electoral College going to be with us forever as a sort of winner-take-all state by state?
You know, the thing about the Electoral College is that the people who have the power, these states in the middle of the country, the ones with fewer cities and actually fewer people, they have the power, and they would have to give up some of that power. And I just never see that quite happening. I think we're going to have to find ways to live with it. Maybe if climate change takes over, people will start moving into some of these emptier areas, and we'll see a different electorate. The one thing I was going to say, in talking about what Clyde is talking about, I've been looking at Florida because Michael Bloomberg is putting a lot of money in Florida, and his reason for doing that is that he believes that Florida is really key to Trump's success, and if Trump should lose Florida, there's no way he can get 270 electoral votes. But what I see there, and I think we see it in other places as well, is that Democrats are coming out in droves and voting in person and sending in their mail-in ballots and that sort of thing. And especially in places like Florida, the Republicans are coming in on election day. And so even though, for example, Democrats are way ahead in states like Florida, the election day wave of Republicans could make a big difference. So I think, I wouldn't bet the farm on either candidate at this point.
And of course, it could make go ahead.
I'm sorry, one very quick point about the Electoral College. I don't think you're ever going to really get rid of it, but what you can do is undermine it. And there is a move to have states mandate their electors to vote for whichever candidate wins the popular vote. There were already a whole bunch of states with collective total of electoral votes in the high 100s who have supported this kind of move. Now, it's a long way from the high 100s to 270, but should this kind of movement ever gain ground, that's one way to undercut this terribly anti-democratic institution that we have and make it.
Of course, that is up to the states. That is up to the states. It's not in the Constitution. Mara, a quick last question. What constitutes a landslide or a mandate for either candidate? How much?
I actually want to go back to this discussion we were having before, because I think it's extremely relevant to what you're asking, which what we're facing here is the prospect of having a cemented minority rule in this country. And you see that when you see the Supreme Court and the makeup of the court, which bears no reflection not only on the will of the majority of Americans, but also on whom they have chosen as their president for the past 20 years. So I think that's number one. But also, the Electoral College itself, as you guys just said, has a lot of problems. I mean, this really goes back to the election of 1876. My fears about this election are reflected in what happened then when you had Tilden, who won by 250,000 votes, the popular vote, but ended up losing the presidency.
So quickly, give me a number, a percentage.
No, I don't. What I'm saying is, I don't think that there is any scenario in which we'll have a legitimate presidency if it is gained through illegitimate means.
Fair enough. Mara Gay, Eleanor Randolph, Clyde Haberman of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. Coming up next, a COVID crackdown backlash in New York's ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. Governor Cuomo won't apologize to New Yorkers' ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities over his COVID hotspot lockdowns. Many in those communities, like Borough Park and Williamsburg, have not followed COVID safety rules, such as wearing masks and social distancing. The virus surged in those areas, and officials tried to enforce restrictions on synagogues, yeshivas, and large gatherings. In April, police were called to break up the funeral of a local rabbi when thousands of people turned out in the streets. Virus cases subsided, so did restrictions. But then COVID cases flared again in those neighborhoods. Cuomo ordered a new lockdown. That set off angry demonstrations by the Orthodox in those areas. They claimed their religious rights were being trampled on. The Times wrote, quote, Mr. Cuomo was spurred by spiking caseloads in the Orthodox community and concerns that health rules were not being followed. But some Orthodox voices have responded by arguing that their community's religious life was being targeted by the government. How can Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio strike a balance between protecting public health and respecting religious freedom? Joseph Goldstein covers healthcare for the New York Times. He's been reporting on this story. Joe, we've had this complaint both from the Catholic Diocese in Brooklyn and the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. How do public officials reconcile those two important freedoms, freedom of religion, and also the freedom to protect all New Yorkers from any kind of public health pandemic?
I don't have the answer of how they do reconcile it. I can say that presently they're struggling to. And I guess there are two issues here. There's a restriction that closes a lot of yeshivas and parochial schools in certain hotspot zip codes, which impinges on religious life. And then the governor also introduced pretty severe restrictions on houses of worship as well, capping attendance at 10 people, the number of a minyan, at synagogues, which it was really that restriction that created this backlash in the Orthodox community, where that restriction was announced. And that night, there were protests in the street and bonfires in the street, and that sort of led to where we are now.
Even 10, isn't that an arbitrary figure? It's not arbitrary in terms of a minyan in Jewish congregations, but is it arbitrary in terms of medical protocol?
You know, I don't think there's sort of a magic number. I think all of public health is often a balancing act of competing needs, and the more people, the higher the risk of a super spreader event. And 10 feels like a small group and satisfies a religious requirement for Orthodox Jews.
Joe, one of the things you've written about in the Times is that the feuds between Cuomo and de Blasio have led to chaos in the crackdown on the virus. Why do they, well, this is sort of a silly question, but why can't they speak to each other and agree on a common protocol? Why does one announce one thing, another announces another? Why can't these people just talk to each other and come up with a common platform?
So that's been a pattern throughout this whole pandemic, and it's fascinating if you look at how these restrictions get written and sort of how the sausage is made. It's not as thoughtful or deliberative a process as one would hope for. There are a lot of very smart epidemiologists and public health officials working for both the city and state. But it's the way these restrictions get crafted. I mean, I could walk you through this with this latest round. It was the mayor was wrestling with what to do with this flare up in South Brooklyn. And there were some proposals to close non-essential businesses. And then there was a wrestling with sort of what to do about schools. And the truth is that there hadn't really been any significant outbreaks traced to schools. There wasn't much evidence that they were contributing to transmission. But there was also the fact that a lot of yeshivas were defying sort of public health safeguards. And so at a certain point, the mayor decides they're going to close non-essential businesses and also schools in these certain zip codes. And he floats that proposal, and the governor responds with sort of his frequent assertion, which is, you can't do that, that's my prerogative. And then he comes up with a different plan. And how much of that is because public health officials recommended a different plan, or how much of it is because of his irritation with his foil, the mayor, is something that still we're trying to sort out. But the plan that he comes back with ignores zip codes, saying that's not the right boundary, and instead sort of draws these lines on a map, and adds another restriction, which is that synagogues would also, and houses of worship would also have a cap on attendance. And he did it in a way that I think one can call clumsy, and in some ways inflammatory, which is he described that there were clearly social distancing violations in synagogues, and he posted a bunch of pictures that he said came from recent weeks, and they showed lots of Orthodox Jews crowded together. And it's absolutely true that in many synagogues there were mass gatherings with no masks in sight. But one of the photos that the governor used in his press conference announcing these restrictions is over 10 years old. And if you're going to build a case for the public health need to close houses of worship, you should probably use true evidence as opposed to a dated picture that sort of feeds into a narrative that has taken hold in Borough Park and elsewhere, that the governor is singling out the Jews and trafficking in old stereotypes of Jews as purveyors of disease.
That's right, especially since you would think he could find accurate current pictures that would support that case. Joe Goldstein of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.